Good evening, Frederick Douglass Elementary School. This is Mrs. Shupard, and tonight we're going to be continuing our novel, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And this is the One Book, One Seaford book, so I hope you've been following along. And we are going to read chapter 6 and chapter 7 tonight. Chapter 6 is called My School Assignment. The following week, I was at home listening to the radio when I heard something better than any Christmas gift. The National Examinations Board has released the results of this year's Standard 8 exams, the announcer said. I raced to the kitchen to find my mother. My scores, I shouted. My scores are ready. I took off running toward Wimby Primary, leaping over stones and puddles along the trail, for once forgetting about my hunger. I wondered which secondary school I would be attending, Kamkwamba or Kansungu. Ever since I decided I wanted to be a scientist, I knew these two schools were the best for me. They had the finest teachers, libraries, and laboratories where a scientist could master his experiments. Of course, I didn't care which one I attended. Wherever those chaps needed me, I'd happily go. A crowd of students had gathered around outside the administration building. I pushed my way towards the front and found the list. The various schools were posted with their respective students slotted down. I quickly found Kasungu and scanned the names. Nothing. Moving toward Chayamba, my finger scrolled over the names: Colombo, Kalimu, then Makalani. Wait a minute, I thought, there must be a mistake. Here you are, Kamkwamba, said the boy named Michael, who was one of the best students. Your name is here under Kachokolo. Sure enough, he was right, but Chikokolo Secondary was probably the worst school in the district. Like Wimbe, it was a community school and very poor. No science programs, no laboratories, just rain through a leaky roof. How can this be, I wondered. Then I saw the exam scores posted on the next board. Out of the 5 subjects, I'd scored only 1 B in Chewa, which was the easiest. Everything else was marked C and D. I was going to Kachokolo because my grades stunk. My heart dropped into my stomach. I imagined the long walk to Kachokolo, about 3 miles away. It was near a big tobacco farm. A river flowed nearby where Jeffrey Gilbert and I sometimes went fishing. The road was usually filled with mud. Michael slapped me on the shoulder and laughed. Congratulations! If anything, you'll become a great fisherman. The only good thing about Kachokolo was that Gilbert was also going. His grades stunk too. In any case, in 2 weeks, we'd be walking the long, muddy road together. The new year arrived with steady rains that encouraged our maize to grow. The seedlings had sprouted well without fertilizer and still seemed healthy. By now, their stalks were deep green and reached my father's shins. The rains made everything come alive. All across the region, the flowers bloomed and the forests and the bushes bloomed. Everywhere you went, the land smelled rich and fragrant. It was all a cruel joke, of course, because nothing was ready to eat. In the trading center, the businessmen raised the price of maize to 1,000 kwacha per pail. The hungry people who'd long ago turned to eating gaga started getting sick when the traders began mixing it with sawdust. When this was discovered, an angry mob formed around the men. I spent all my money only to get a belly full of sawdust, one shouted. My children are home vomiting. You people are criminals. The hungry people could complain all they wanted, but with no money in their pockets, they had no power. Several resorted to crime. One afternoon, my mother arrived as usual with her cakes and set up her stand. Within seconds, a crowd of people descended, shouting and grabbing at her things. I'll take 2, a woman said. Give me 3, said another. In this chaos, my mother didn't notice that others were snatching cakes from her basin and running away. One man grabbed 3 cakes, but instead of fleeing, he sat down and ate them right there. 9 kwacha, my mother demanded. I don't have any money, he answered. That evening when she returned, her hair was wild and her face was full of worry. They took almost everything, she said, and she was right. For supper, there was only crumbs. As the price of maize continued to rise, my mother bought less and less flour. The number of cakes she sold began to shrink, and so did the nightly blob of tsima. First it was 7 mouthfuls, then 5, then 4, then 3. Every time you put tsima in your mouth, add some water, she told us. That way you trick your stomach. At supper, we kids were careful about our portions. We wanted to be fair. My sister Rose, who was 7 years old, became greedy. Often she grabbed large handfuls of tsima and stuffed them in her mouth before anyone could stop her. Hey, slow down, shouted Doris. Maybe you should eat faster, answered Rose. We were all becoming thin, especially the youngest ones like Rose. My parents never scolded her for taking more than her share, but one night Doris reached her breaking point. When Rose grabbed a big chunk of tsima, Doris leaped across the basin and began punching her in the face. Mama, cried Rose. My mother struggled to pull them apart, then collapsed against the wall. Please, she pleaded, I just don't have the strength. That night, we went to bed hungry again with the smell of food on our fingers, a smell that even the hottest water couldn't wash clean. The worse things got with the famine, the more I looked forward to school. Somehow being hungry in the classroom full of students, full of friends, seemed a lot easier than being hungry at home. As the big day approached, I tried my best to be ready. The first problem I encountered was my uniform. Back when we still had money, my mother had sent me to the used clothing stalls in the trading center to buy a white shirt. Well, since my wardrobe only consisted of 2 shirts in total, I ended up wearing the white one a lot and got it dirty. Then we ran out of soap. Back when the troubles began, we had been using a bar of cheap Malua lye soap, which the whole family shared for bathing and washing clothes. Then it finally ran out. We were too broke to buy another. We could wash our bodies with warm water, and balogwe bushes acted like sponges, but a white shirt wasn't so easy. I tried everything. I boiled it over a fire, let it soak until the water was cool, then scrubbed until my shoulders were sore. Nothing worked, so I started school with the yellow circles under my armpits and a gray ring around the collar. What could I do? That morning I met Gilbert on the road so we could walk together. Gilbert, Bo. Sure. Fit. My friend, this is the day we've been waiting for. Indeed, we should be ready to be bullied by the older boys. Yeah, I think so. What do you think will hit us first? Who do you think will hit us first? That's just it. If an older boy approaches us and he's too muscular, I say we deal with him straight away. Good plan. So who would hit him first, me or you? Definitely you. The 3-mile walk to Kichokolo took us over the hills and across the maize fields and past the dambos where we hunted as boys. The school sat in a valley surrounded by tobacco farms where we watched tractors plow a field and a few lucky men with jobs enjoying the day's work. Once at school, we gathered for the morning assembly. Our principal, Mr. W.M. Feary, no relation to the fighter from my father's tall tales, stood before us dressed in a brown threadbare suit. He was an older man with a bald head except for bushels of gray hair that grew around his ears. Mr. Feary started to say how happy he was to see such promising students, and he was right. We were a fine-looking bunch, and all of us were so excited to be continuing our education. In Malawi, secondary school was a privilege and an honor. In fact, I was certain that I was experiencing the greatest moment of my life. But like in any institution of learning, he said, this school has rules that must be followed. Every student should be punctual and dressed in the proper uniform. If not, punishment will be swift. After assembly was over, I was walking to class when Mr. Fury tapped me on the shoulder. "What's your name?" he said. I spun around and froze. "William Trywell Kamkwamba," I muttered, unable to hide my nerves. "Well, William, this is not the proper uniform." I threw both hands under my arms to hide the yellow stains, but Mr. Fury was pointing at my feet. "Sandals are not allowed," he said. "We require students to wear proper footwear at all times. Please go home and change." I looked down at my flip-flops, which had seen better days. The rubber connecting the sole was broken on one of the sandals, forcing me to carry a needle and thread in my pocket for emergency repairs. I didn't have another pair of shoes at home. I had to think fast. "Mr. Headmaster, sir," I said, "I would put on proper footwear, but I live in Wimbe and must cross 2 streams to get there. And because it is the rainy season, my mom doesn't want me ruining any good leather shoes in the mud." He scrunched his eyebrows and considered this. I prayed it would work. "Fine," he said, "but once the rains are over, I want to see you in proper footwear." My parents didn't have the money for school books either. In Malawi, the schools didn't provide learning materials like they did in America. Even in better times, most of the students couldn't afford to buy their own books and had to share. At Wimbe Primary, that meant squeezing your bottoms together in the same seat and hoping your friend didn't read faster than you. Luckily for me, Gilbert always had his own books and allowed me to look on. The two of us even read at the same level. As I mentioned, the conditions at Wimbe Primary had been terrible. Holes in the roof that let in the rain, no glass in the windows to stop the cold winter wind, lessons held under trees, and of course I told you the terrible stories about the latrines. I was hoping for a better environment at Kachokolo, but no such luck. When Gilbert and I arrived at our new classroom, our teacher, Mr. Tembo, instructed us to sit on the floor. "The government has no money for desks and chairs," he said, looking embarrassed, "or anything else for that matter. Certainly not for repairs." In the center of the floor was a giant hole where it looked like a bomb had exploded. The walls were chipped and coming apart. The damp breeze blew through the broken windows, and sure enough, when I looked up at the ceiling, I saw a lot of blue sky. To my delight, Mr. Tumbo was a kind, soft-spoken man who was patient about the setbacks. Like most teachers in community schools, he lived in a small house next door with his wife and children. His clothes were old and a bit ragged, and the small vegetable garden behind his house could hardly sustain his family. But unlike the farmers, he received a meager salary that allowed for some extra grain during the hunger. Even still, I'd seen his kids in the yard before school with their arms and legs were as skinny as mine. Despite the poor conditions, Mr. Tembo wasted no time starting our lessons. Right away, we began studying history, covering early civilization in China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. We learned about early forms of writing and how these cultures communicated with one another. I'd always had trouble in math, but I love our discussions about angles and degrees and how to use a ruler to take measurements. I remembered hearing those words from the builders in the training center. One afternoon, we began our lesson in geography. Mr. Tumbo pulled out a map of the world and asked us to find the continent of Africa, which was easy. "Now, can anyone find Malawi?" he asked. "Yeah, here it is." We ran our fingers lovingly over our country. I couldn't believe how small it was compared to the rest of the world. To think, my whole life and everything in it had taken place in this little strip of earth. On the map, the land was green and the lake appeared to be a blue jewel. It was hard to guess that 11 million people lived in that tiny space, and at that very moment, nearly all of us were slowly starving. That week, I realized I had been wrong. The hunger was just as painful at school as it was at home. All day, my stomach growled and gave my brain no peace, and soon it was too difficult to pay attention. At first, my classmates and I were eager to raise our hands and answer one of Mr. Tumbo's questions. A few of us even competed to be the first one called. "Kamkwamba, here, over here," I'd shouted. But after 2 weeks, a silence fell over the room each morning and never lifted. Faces became thinner and since we had no soap or lotions at home, our skin gradually turned dry and gray, as if dusted in ash. During recess, a few of my friends simply walked off campus to search for food and never returned. None of this mattered anyway. On the first day of February, W.M. Feary made the following announcement at Assembly. The administration is aware of the problem across the country, which we all face, but many of you still haven't paid your school fees for this term. Starting tomorrow, the free period is over. My worst fear had come true. I knew my father hadn't paid my fears, but who was I kidding? We were eating 1 meal per day. We couldn't afford to buy a bar of soap, which much less pay 1,200 kwacha for my school. Walking home, I got mad at myself for even getting excited and coming in the first place. I had allowed myself a glimpse of the dream, and now it was crumbling all about. What am I going to do? I asked Gilbert. I have no choice but to face the music. Don't stress, he said. Just go home and see what happens. When I arrived home, I found my father in the fields. At school, they're saying I should bring my fees tomorrow, 1,200 kwacha, I said, so we should pay them. Mr. Feary wasn't joking around. My father stared at the dirt for a long time, then said, "You know our problem here, son. Right now, we have nothing to spare. I'm so sorry." The next morning, I stood by the road and waited for Gilbert. For some reason, I still wore my school uniform, but I wasn't going anyplace. When Gilbert appeared and waved, I let him walk past. "What's the matter?" he said, turning around. "Aren't you coming to school?" I wanted to cry. "I'm dropping out. My parents don't have the money." Gilbert looked upset, which somehow made me feel better. "So sorry, friend. Hopefully they can find it." "Yes, perhaps," I said. "See you later, Gilbert." I walked down to Jeffrey's house to give him the news. A few weeks before, he'd gotten lucky when a bolt of lightning knocked down a tree in his yard. He chopped it into bundles and sold it as firewood along the road. It was enough to keep his family eating for a while, or at least I thought so. Jeffrey was getting dressed when I entered his room, and the sight of him made me gasp. He'd lost so much weight. His eye sockets were sunken and dark, but the white parts of his eyes seemed to glow. This is what starving people look like, I thought. They look like ghosts. "Why aren't you in school?" he asked. "Didn't you get selected for Cacholo?" "No money. Today I dropped." "Oh," he muttered, then went quiet. "Me and you, we're in the same desperate situation. I hope God has a plan for us." "Yeah," I said, "me too." In the afternoon, I waited by the road to meet Gilbert as he walked home. When he saw me, he was shaking his head. "Almost everyone dropped out," he said. "Today, we were few. Out of the 70 students, only 20 remained." Chapter 7, A Time of Dying. The following week, the Gaga finally ran out in the trading center. People began living on pumpkin leaves, and when that was gone, they sifted through the garbage for banana peels and old corn cobs. Along our road, they dug up tree roots and ate grass, anything to fill their stomachs. As starvation set in, their bodies began to change. Some people became so thin they looked like walking skeletons. Others came down with kwashiorkor, a condition caused by a lack of protein. Instead of shriveling like everyone else, their arms, legs, and bellies swelled with fluid and became fat. In another of the famine's cruel jokes, the reality was that they were dying. Every day, the starving people stopped by our house and begged my father for help. They saw we had iron sheets on one part of our house and thought we were rich, even though they were fastened by stones. Some of the men said that they'd walk 30 miles. "If you have one biscuit, please, I can work," they begged, their bare feet so swollen they couldn't wear sandals. "We're now 6 days without eating. If you have just a small plate of tsima." "I have nothing," my father insisted. "I'm barely feeding my own family." "Just give us porridge," they demanded. I said no. A few men were too weak to continue and slept in our yard all night. The ground and the wood were too wet for fires, and when the rains came in the darkness, they curled up under our porch and shivered. By morning, they were gone. A few nights later, we were sitting outside having our meal when a man approached from the road. He was covered in mud and so thin it was hard to understand how he was even alive. His teeth protruded from his shriveled mouth, and his hair was falling out. Without saying hello, he sat down beside us. Then, to my horror, he reached his dirty hand into our bowl and ripped off a giant piece of sema. We sat there in shock, saying nothing as he closed his eyes and chewed. He swallowed deeply and satisfyingly, and when the mouthful was safely in his stomach, he turned to my father. "Do you have more?" "I'm sorry," my father said. "Okay then," the man replied, and stood up and walked away. The crowds continued to pour in from the bush. More than ever, they converged in the trading center like herds of crazed animals driven together by fire. Women with gaunt, ashen faces sat alone, pleading with God, but they did it quietly and without tears. Anguish was expressed mostly in silence, since few had the energy to cry. Some traders still spread their tarps in the mud and sold grain, but the units had become smaller and smaller, and its price was like gold, like buying the universe had stars in 1/2 kilo. Crowds gathered around, but mostly to stare in stunned amazement as if watching a dream in heaven. Those with energy used it to scream and beg so their families might live. "Buana, just a small plate of flour for my child. That's all I need. It's for my child." "Hey, if I start with you," the traders answered, then said nothing at all. The ones with energy edged closer, lunging like a wolf pack whenever a kernel fell on the ground, shuffling gravel and all into their mouths. Each group told a different story of the dead. There was the man who'd spent days looking for food, one man said. One morning, he decided to nap under a tree and never woke up. "I was cooking," said another. When a man came up and sat down, he said he needed to eat, but before the scene was ready, he too was dead. Another had gone so many days without eating, the first bellyful of food sent their bodies into fatal shock. One woman stepped over 2 dead men in the road, still pitifully clutching their hoes. Men whose legs had swollen with kwashiorkor tried to drain their giant blisters with a knife, only to die later from infection. The people on the roads weren't the only ones wasting away. One night in early February, I sat down to eat my small portion of sema and noticed Kamba standing in the open door, his head hung low and his eyes drooped, and by lantern light I could count each rib pressing beneath his skin. The walk across the courtyard had exhausted him. Like so many others in Wimbe, my dog was starving to death. His last big meal had been the Christmas goat skin, which had given him strength to even added a little weight. But since then, I'd managed to feed him only 5 times, just a small handful of sema and little more. I had nothing to give him tonight. "Sorry, friend," I said, and I felt a lump swell in my throat. "I just can't share." It didn't take me long to eat. When the food was gone and out of sight, I stepped over Kamba and went to my room. I lay down on the bed and fell into a strange, fitful sleep. That night I dreamt that my stomach had taken over my entire body, filling my arms, legs, and head like a great big balloon. But at some point in the dream, it had popped and left only emptiness. It turned out my stomach had only been filled with air, now shriveled and useless, and howled in anguish. I took deep breaths to try to fill it again, but it was no use. My whole body ached. "I have to eat," I thought. I lay there listening to the rain on my roof, then gathered the strength to move. I got out of bed and made my way outside. I stopped at the kitchen door and peeked in. Kamba was curled by the fire, which had long lost its heat. "Kamba," I shouted, "let's go hunting." The very word made him shoot upright as if he'd been shot. He slapped his tail against the floor and struggled to his feet. It had been a year since I'd said those words to him, and still he was ready. In fact, his tail swung so hard I thought that it would knock him back over. Let's go get some food, boy. I had no maize or gaga for my trap, so I grabbed a handful of ash from the fire pit and threw it into a sugar bag. We set off down the trail towards the Doa highland, which seemed forever draped in turmoil. We walked slowly to conserve energy, and I whistled a happy tune to raise our spirits. The maize in our field was growing tall and green, and I knew it wouldn't be long until we could eat. Maybe a month, perhaps a bit longer. Soon this darkness would lift. I looked across the sky for birds, but saw none. At the trap site, I fastened the rubber to the poles and set the trigger. I sprinkled the ash along the ground and sighed. It looked pathetic. Let's hope these birds aren't as hungry as we are, I said. If we could get 3 birds, perhaps tonight I could sleep better. Perhaps Kamba could gain some strength and hang on for another week. I took the rope and dragged it behind the nearby tree where the dog and I stretched out and waited. He immediately fell asleep. 15 minutes later, a small flock of birds swooped down and landed beside the trap. Kamba's head shot up, as if he had seen them in his dreams. As they hopped toward the kill zone, I let my imagination wander. I pictured the warm fire in the courtyard, felt my hands rubbing the salt into the meat, then hanging the pieces over the embers. I heard the sizzle and breathed in the rich aroma. The sudden pounding of my heart snapped me out of my daydream just in time to see the birds approach the bait. I was about to pull the rope when they realized it was only ash and flew away in a burst of wings. I exhaled in defeat. I may have even cried. That night back at home, Kamba fell into a deep, scary slumber. It was a difficult time waking him, even with some zima and pumpkin leaves I'd saved from dinner. Kamba, I shouted, supper. He opened his eyes and gave me a slap of his tail. I tossed the food into the air, but he had made no effort, and it landed with a thud on the ground. Several minutes passed before he could lift himself to eat. His body quivered when he swallowed. 2 days later, I fed him again. It was only some pumpkin leaves, so I walked over and spooned them into his bowl. I wish it was more, I said, but it's all I can manage. But as soon as the food hit Kwamba's stomach, he vomited it back up. I knew the end was near. Just wait 1 month. We'll be feasting in a month. The next morning, my cousin Charity stopped by the house. He was with his friend, Mizek, whom I didn't recognize at first. Mizek had always been a big guy and a real bruiser, but now I could see the skull in his face. When he saw Kamba, his voice got a bit crazy. Look at this thing, he said. This dog's pathetic. Kamba was half asleep, moving by the flies nesting on his coat. He'd long stopped caring. I can't even stand to look at it, he said. I tried changing the subject. So what are you chaps doing today, I said. Going to the trading center as usual, Charity replied. Perhaps we'll find some ganyu, but it's not so hopeful. While Charity and I talked, Mizek kept his eyes on Kamba like he was obsessed. He said, you need to put this thing out of its misery. Take it behind the house and use a big stone. I pretended not to hear him. He's right, William, Charity said. I can't. Can't you see that the dog's suffering? Take him to the Dumbo, where the water is high. It will be painless. Wait a minute, I said, stammering. What are you guys saying? We're saying it's time to be a man, said Mizek. I wanted to smash his face. My dog is fine, I said. He's going to get better. It's just a month and we'll be... If you can't do it yourself, Mizek snapped, then we'll do it for you. I looked at Charity, who then lowered his voice. It's the right thing to do, William. Don't worry. You won't even have to bother. We'll stop by tomorrow and take him. We won't feel a thing. I struggled to find words, some form of protest, but Mizek's crazy eyes stole my breath. They were yellow like a bitten hyena. When Mizek and Charity finally left, I felt dizzy and weak, as if my legs were made of grass. I sat down beside Kamba and watched him sleep. The flies circled and landed. I must have been there half an hour before he finally opened his eyes and saw me. Then he gave a slow flip of the tail. The way he looked at me, even in this state, made me remember our days together, how we would walk without even speaking. I decided then that I couldn't let Mazek and Charity take him. I considered my options until the compound grew dark, then finally had my answer. They were right about Kamba, he was suffering, but they were wrong about me. I could be a man. The next morning, I was sitting with Kamba when Charity appeared in the courtyard. My pulse quickened. I looked at the dog and he looked at the dog and started towards us, but before he could say anything, I stood up. I'm taking him, he said. What? I'm taking him to the forest. He looked confused. A stone is very quick, he said. So is the Dombo. This is what I want, Charity nodded. It's the right thing to do. We'll do it together today. That afternoon, when Charity returned, we walked to the shady place behind my room where Kamba slept. He hadn't moved since the previous night. Kamba, I said, let's go hunting. His head perked up. I said, let's go. He staggered to his feet, shook once to loosen the flies, and hobbled toward me. It took us ages to get out of the compound. I had to walk backward in front of him to keep him moving. Come on, boy, you can do it. We walked down the road toward the highlands. The sun was sinking in the west and colored the hills with tangerine glow. The air felt warm and dry. It was the perfect weather for hunting. We entered the blue gum groves that Kamba knew so well. At one point, Charity turned off the trail and said, this way. Kamba and I followed, struggling through the high grass. The tears were hot in my throat, but I swallowed them down. Charity looked at me. Don't be upset, he said. It's just a dog. I nodded. Yeah, just a dog. After several minutes, we stopped where the brush was thick and the grass reached our chests. The mountains were visible over the blue gums. This is a good place, Charity said. No one will pass here. It didn't feel right. Sure enough, turning around, I could still see the top of my house. It's too close, I said. This dog can't go any farther. I looked over at Kamba. He'd collapsed in the tall grass under the tambozi tree and was panting heavily. Without a word, Charity started stripping bark from the kachiri tree to make a long rope. I turned my back and stared into the forest. When his hands went quiet, I knew it was ready. Tie him to the tree, I said. Charity lashed a rope to the trunk of the tambozi, then tied the other end to the dog's leg. Once the knot was fastened, he turned and walked away. When I followed, Kamba raised his head and began to whine. He knew I was leaving him. After a few steps down the trail, I made the enormous mistake of turning to look. His eyes were still on me. Then he laid down his head. I did a terrible thing, I said, and then walked faster through the trees. Once we reached the compound, Charity went home and I walked toward my room. Along the way, I passed Kamba's food bowl sitting in the hen house. I picked it up and hurled it against the ground, shattering it to pieces. It's just a dog, I thought. I stayed awake long into the night, knowing that Kamba was just down the hill. If I screamed his name loud enough, I thought he could probably hear me. The next day, I avoided everyone and stayed busy in the fields. Once I got home that afternoon, Socrates was there visiting my father. Have you seen Kamba, he asked. I can't find him anywhere. I haven't seen him, I said. Well, I hope those wild dogs didn't get him. Yeah, I replied, me too. That night, I tried to force Kamba out of my mind, but I kept seeing him in the tall grass. The image never stayed long, for I was too hungry to concentrate on anything. The next morning, Charity found me in my room. Let's go see what happened to Kamba, he said. What do you mean? Let's go see if he's dead. He carried a hoe in his hand and told me to grab mine. We'll bring them so people will think we're going to the fields. That way we can bury him. We set off with our tools, but I was too mixed up for conversation. We turned off the trail and into the bush, where the grass was still wet from the morning dew and soaked my trousers. After a while, I saw a white hump on the ground. Look, Charity said, is he dead? We walked closer. Kamba was in the same position as when we'd left him. His head rested on his front paws and his eyes were wide open. I gasped, expecting him to move. Then I saw his tongue sticking out. It was like dry and paper and covered in ants. Kamba is dead, I said. The rope hadn't budged. There had been no struggle. A terrible thought seized me. After Kamba watched me go, he'd surrendered his will to live, which meant that I'd killed him. While Charity untied the rope, I started digging the hole. A furious energy came over me and I worked faster than I had in months. When the grave was ready, Charity and I pushed Kamba's body inside, then paused. So long, Kamba, I said. You were a good friend. We filled the grave with soil and left no marker. We even concealed the freshly dug earth with grass and leaves. When Charity and I returned home, we told no one what we'd done. It's remained a secret all these years, until now. Well, that's the end of chapter 7. So next week we will pick up at chapter 8. I'm gonna say good night, sleep tight, and sweet dreams.